now resumed.
Morning, Ms. Gardner.
Morning, Commissioner. So it's a great pleasure and much honor that I stand here before you, Mr. Commissioner, after all of these months and work that we have done together. As you know, our coalition has been here, I think, every day of this inquiry in an effort to assist you in your work. And so today I'm going to start with some opening comments, and then I'm going to give you a walk through the terms of reference that I think are important in how you frame your work and the work and the evidence that's been done. It will come as no surprise to you that I'll spend a little time on conservation and collaboration and how those are linked together. And then I will move on to what I think is one of the strengths of the work that we have done and have offered to you in the voluminous pages that our strong team has provided to you, which is to review the causes, the state of the stocks and the causes of decline. Because as I often say, it's important to understand the nature of the challenges and the problems that we have in order to look towards the types of solutions that might be useful to us. And so I think it's extremely important that I spend some time on that. And so I think the first half of my submissions will be there in the state of the stocks and the causes of decline. And then I will turn to the policies and practice and procedures that we think are relevant to your considerations. And hopefully I will have enough time in my concluding comments, which will be the 7th round that we'll have together in terms of topics, to walk you through a little bit of the work that we have done on proposed recommendations for your consideration. So I begin by saying it's an honor and privilege to carry the responsibility of representing the First Nations coalitions in this inquiry. And from this humble place, I offer these prayers of gratitude, first to the large collection of First Nations and First Nations organizations within our coalition who have entrusted our team with the work that we have diligently accepted. So often there is a perception that First Nations can't work together. We disagree, and we believe this coalition has showed very clearly that the matters of conservation and sustainability of wild salmon fisheries, there is much common ground amongst First Nations, and that common ground is palpable in the work that we have done before you. I have gratitude for all the meetings and calls and the perspectives and the education that my clients have provided our team, and because it has been invaluable in the work that I have done before you, Commissioner Cohen. Next, I have much gratitude for the team, Leah Pence, Crystal Reeves, Anya Brown, and Chloe Ostro, for the long days and nights of work that I am deeply grateful for. Their work is around you. It's surrounding you in all the pages that we have done and all of the pages and exhibits that we have provided to you. I also want to thank Mr. Lund, Natasha Tam, and Sarah Panchak, and all of Commission Counsel. This is a complex task, a complex piece of work, a complex group of people working, and it has been cordial, respectful, and I am grateful for that. Finally, well, not so quite finally, I want to extend my gratitude to you, Mr. Commissioner. It has been my observation that you listen deeply and that you are respectful and patient. And those 3 skills are extremely important skills in the work of Fraser River Sockeye. It is what we as organizations and people working with salmon must do more and more with each other. We must listen deeply, we must be respectful, and we must be patient with each other so that we can hear each other well and move on together. And so it's those skills of yours that I have been grateful that our paths have crossed. I often wonder how best to help you in this task. I trust our diligent work will inform your efforts and that we have fairly represented to you the evidence in a balanced way through the written submissions and our work. You can see that the First Nation Coalition took the work of this commission seriously and that we have not been here to waste each other's time. Finally, I want to be very grateful to the Fraser River Sockeye salmon. It's a resilient resource of an amazing place called the Pacific Northwest. I pray to the Creator that these last round of my words will help shed light with you on the world where wild salmon, in this case Fraser salmon, have a place in the circle and web of life and at our tables, all of our tables. So turning to the terms of reference. When you look at your terms of reference, and in particular in section A1, Roman numeral, or large A, you get the first two critical principles on which you work. Commissioner Cohen, I think you have two principles from which you have to look at all of this evidence, and then you have three tasks. And those principles are extremely important. The principles of the conservation of Fraser River sockeye salmon, that is not in debate. That is the principle under which you are to work. And the second principle, equally important, is the encouragement of broad cooperation amongst stakeholders. That is another principle on which you are to work. That's why it's important you understand the perspectives and the skills and the responsibilities that First Nations can bring to this table. Because you must encourage collaboration. And collaboration will and must include a respectful, active place at the table for First Nations. Secondly, and the work that you then have is to investigate and make findings of fact regarding two things: the current state of Fraser River sockeye salmon and the causes of decline. And that's why I'm going to take time through that, because the evidence has been complex and we've done our best to distill it. And so I'm going to take you through those places where we've distilled those two key components. And then you're asked to consider the policies and practices, including a whole risk of those things, and then develop recommendations. And those policies and practices are relevant to your two principles, that the principle of conservation and the principle of encouraging broad cooperation. And it's those matters that I will bring to your attention in detail. It perhaps goes without saying, but I must put on the record that we rely in full on our written submissions, both in the main and their reply, and our oral submissions here are simply to complement the work, shed light through the oral tradition on the many days of evidence and pages of words that we have written. We also rely fully on our written submissions in reply to PPR number 1. I always think that's so important, but the foundational PPR has been the one on Aboriginal rights and title. And we draw your attention to something we raised at the beginning of this inquiry, which is, of course, it is not your job to determine new law. It is a challenge not to understand the law related to DFO's obligations to conserve and honorably respect Section 35 rights. The challenge is to apply it in a manner that addresses the complexities, both of Fraser River sockeye salmon and, more difficultly, the humans. The First Nations Coalition is one of the few participant groups in this inquiry that was awarded a full grant of standing. We've been actively participating on all matters. And why? Because it illustrates the breadth and depth of the concern First Nations have regarding all matters and issues related to the Fraser River sockeye salmon. While there are many reasons to be very concerned about the status of the fish and DFO's policies and practices, we were given a particular brief in this matter, which was to approach it forward-looking and recommendation-based. It's easy to criticize. It's easy to find fault. It is much more difficult to find solutions. And the work of the First Nation Coalition has been inspired by the ancestors in aid of this and future generations to look for solutions. Either the specific recommendations or the evidentiary foundation for them has all been canvassed in the hearings before you. We took effort to make sure that our recommendations were founded in the evidence, and that is how we have participated throughout this inquiry. We remain committed. Commissioner Cohen, halfway through this inquiry, one of the chiefs that I represent came and spoke to me about how we are in one step. But I wasn't to worry too much. As you guys see, many times I get worried and I get concerned about the state of many things, not only the stocks, but the humans. And he reminded me that we're on one step further along the path of reconciliation. And that is your work. It is the work of one step further along the path of reconciliation. It is your job to find in that path a place that engenders the most collaboration amongst governments, and in this case there are three primary governments: Canada, the province, and First Nations, NGOs, and all the stakeholders interested in the long-term sustainability of the Fraser River sockeye salmon. So why is First Nations perspectives important to you? Because they are a keen government, a government keen to exercise their responsibilities in this matter, not to abdicate them. They are keen to work with those that are stakeholders and NGOs and other governments who care about the long-term sustainability of Fraser River sockeye salmon. Their traditional laws require them. It's not a debate to honor and respect salmon so that they may ensure the sustainability of their future generations. Aboriginal teachings don't separate species from ecological habits and habitats and ecosystems. They include cultural, spiritual ethics in the management of the fisheries. For example, and it's an often one quoted, all relations must be maintained respectfully in order to be sustainable for this and future generations. I hearken back to the early stories that we placed before you to frame your consideration. The Haida people spoke of the supernatural creek woman who stands at the front of the creeks to regulate water flows and look after the salmon as they come and go. And I've often imagined the strength of that woman at the front of the Fraser River. The Secwepemc people told of Coyote and how his deepest gift to the people of this land was the fish, and how their stories, and it was both the Secwepemc stories and the story from Fred Sampson of Sitka that I want to refresh your memory on, because the story that Dr. Ron Ignace came to you to tell was the story of how Coyote not only brought them the biggest gift that they could in their communities, which was the fish, but when his own ethics got mixed up and he got bold or he got wasteful, the salmon left. And they teach the children that from the earliest place. Why? Because it's a cute story? No. Because the fundamental challenge for human salmon relations is one of respect and not arrogance, and no greed. And that's a big one. It's a deep one in all of the evidence that you've looked at. The stewardship and the respect that infuses First Nations approaches to fisheries management is throughout their Indigenous laws, customs, traditions, practices, and stories. Chief Willie Charlie of Chehalis told about how the salmon is medicine food. It's an interesting perspective, given how much food and health their communities rely on. The salmon is not only their brothers and their sisters, but it's medicine. Chief Fred Sampson spoke of how he gets to walk down to his fishing rock, and in that rock there are 3 layers responsive to the different runs that come up that river. And he gets to put his feet in the place where all of his ancestors have been. I had the wonderful good fortune once of walking through Peru and walking along the rocks of people that have left pathways for centuries and centuries for us to come. And Chief Fred Sampson goes down to the river and he puts his feet in the feet of his ancestors in order to put his net, or his net into the river. And then Chief Charlie said to all of us, this great resource belongs to all of us, and it belongs to our future generations. And so it's up to the work of all of us to protect that. This respectful, holistic relationship to salmon within a complex ecosystem that treats salmon as sacred for this and future generations is the ethic that guides First Nations fisheries management. And we submit that this is the ethic that should similarly guide all those who are committed to the long-term sustainability of the Fraser River sockeye salmon and their fisheries. We have a lot to learn from those that have been here. I hearken back to Dr. Douglas Harris's work. As you know, he's the Nathan Nemant's Chair in the Legal History at the University of British Columbia and an author of several books and scholarly articles. And there is some debate as to what he's come to tell you, but I can tell you for sure that an important thing that stayed with me since he left is that, which I believe is very relevant to your terms of reference, is that in this step along the path of reconciliation, and in order to fully understand the challenges and put them in, we must move towards a just fishery. By achieving a just fishery through the way we manage, through the way we allocate, the way we consider it, we will have a functional, efficient, and sustained fishery. There is a recommendation that my friends have taken, a number of friends in this room have taken a touch issue with, that our coalition has put before you, which is that DFO must actively take steps to recognize and affirm Aboriginal title rights and treaty rights, and promote reconciliation with First Nations in all matters related to the fishery, including Fraser River sockeye salmon. Now, some may say that you can't recognize or make findings of fact or law regarding the contents of rights and titles. There's no disagreement with that. We haven't led evidence that could allow you to take that complex issue and make it. As you know, judges are often tasked with that. When tasked with that, take a whole year or two to look at just that in this kind of context. So this is not the correct forum for you to make findings of fact regarding the content or strength of claim. And no findings regarding the rights that are not yet recognized by the courts or by DFO. As I've said, the reality is not whether First Nations hold title rights and treaty rights, it's how those rights change, and more particularly how the responsibilities that flow with those rights. You know, when Aboriginal came to you and talked to you, they didn't talk to you about their rights so much. They talked about the responsibilities that they as leaders and as technical advisors have. It's how those rights change colonial assumptions and priorities and management decisions that ran largely unchecked until Section 35 and Sparrow and Gladstone and Haida and others. DFO must continue its efforts to find a way to become more respectful to First Nations in all matters, and so must all the stakeholders in this room. They are rights holders. Your work must pave the way for that work to move forward if we are going to find collaboration. There are many places of conflict, not only in the courts, but also on the river. And the work that you are to do it provides a unique and important place in the role of collaboration. In 2004, the First Nations panel on fisheries, which is Exhibit 493, and I'm not going to take you to there, articulated a vision for future fisheries management that would place certainty, at least some certainty, to users in terms of access and use of fisheries resources. There are keen recommendations that were put before the Crown and our place at the table, and there is evidence to suggest that the Crown is moving to implement some of those recommendations. However, 7 years after the release of our place at the table, many of these recommendations are still waiting to be realized. I think it's important that you consider carefully that exhibit, Commissioner Cohen, because it takes you quite to the present of the nature of the work and the recommendations that we need going forward. So now I have to take you to the second principle in your terms of reference, which is the principle of respecting conservation. I'm at page 15, paragraphs 48 and 49 of our submissions. But where I want to really say is that at the most basic, and I say this, at the most basic, and this is the words, the persistence of a biodiverse population of salmon allows for the possibility of the persistence of a diverse population of First Nations. They are one and the same. The principle of biodiversity and ecosystem management is an old principle that is an ethical foundation with First Nations. Now, Dr. John Reynolds, the Tom Bewley BC Leadership Chair in Salmon Conservation at SFU, said it this way: in essence, in order to adjust and evolve to changing environmental conditions, including climate change and other impacts of human causes, as well as naturally occurring events, fish need, and here's the quote, as much room to maneuver as possible, as the erosion of diversity constrains the species' options for the future. Dr. Scott Hinch, professor at UBC's Faculty of Forest Sciences in the Institute of Resources, said it this way: in my view, it's paramount to be able to protect as many of these populations as possible. Paramount, because we don't know what environmental conditions are going to change like in all the different life stages, and there will be some populations that may be able to cope particularly well. We just don't know that yet. And having the ability of some of these populations to either expand their range or move their range is going to be important for the persistence of the species. And so this is a standard conservation biological perspective on biodiversity. It's not just mine, and it's not just for Fraser River sockeye. I think that's the way most conservation biologists feel about most populations. It's not about just saving the strong stocks or the big stocks. No biologist has come to you and said that. Not a single biologist has come to say that the way to preserve long-term sustainability of Fraser River sockeye is to focus only on the big stocks. The next principle within conservation that I need to hearken on today is the principle of precaution. And there is at page 18, paragraph 52 onward, we present to you a bit of the dialogue that occurred about the difference between precautionary principles and precautionary approaches. And we found that the work of Dr. Peterman was the most useful, perhaps because he spends a lot of time educating young, inspiring biologists on this, about the difference between the precautionary approach and the precautionary principle. And he had divided into three standard responses. Either you protect it all, you pretend like it's not a problem, and you do whatever you want, or somewhere in between. It's a kind of an interesting division of three standards. I'm at paragraph 60 of my main submissions in 61. And then he goes on to consider how you would choose that appropriate precaution and in what particular situation. And of course, Commissioner Cohen, you are completely familiar with the choice amongst that range of precaution depends on who's going to carry the risk and how that risk is going to be carried. And so, of course, in all matters of fisheries, First Nations have an absolute interest, and in my submission, the Crown has an obligation to consult, and not just to consult, to accommodate the concerns First Nations have about what risks are being taken when and how in relation to these fish. It is in that fundamental start, what research is being done, what's the question for the researcher, how is it going to be done, what decisions are going to be made in the interim, where are we going with this, that those risks and values and approaches are best understood. We can continue to waste time on research if those preliminary eyes are not brought to the questions that are being asked and how we're approaching these. And thankfully, the law makes it clear that DFO is legally required to meaningfully consult with First Nations to understand their values, to deal with their risk tolerances, and to accommodate the interests and concerns. For it is unquestionable that the risks associated with the management of Fraser River sockeye salmon are causing great concerns for First Nations. And they must be adequately informed and consulted regarding those. And thankfully, they are willing to bring their expertise to the table so that those risks are assessed appropriately, and the precautionary principle and the approach moves from words and policies and gets applied on the ground. You know, one of the things that I have so enjoyed about working with Aboriginal people is while they are incredible orators, they watch what people do, not what they say. They watch how we act on the ground. So these policies, and we commend them, are strong. There are things that could be clarified, and if we must, but the effort must be not in clarifying principles, but figuring out how appropriately to put them onto the ground. And I can rest assured that with First Nations at the table, that step will happen. We'll move from talking about principles and talking about approaches to saying, how does that work on the ground? Because that's what they ask on a regular occasion. How is the precautionary principle happening with mixed stock fisheries? How is the precautionary principle happening when we open aggregates before we fully understand what the run size is? How is that being applied? Those are the questions they ask me, and they ask the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And that is an incredibly important question that requires consultation and accommodation. At paragraph 64 on page 22 of my submissions, and I don't need to take you to them again unless you'd like, Commissioner, you'll recall that on a number of occasions I took a number of scientists to exhibit 1348. And 1348 is the expert report that came out of the scientist leaders that have met in April of 2011 to talk about the state of the ocean and where we are in relation to the state of the ocean. You might recall that on a number of occasions, I asked the scientists about scientists that came to give evidence about the recommendation that these world-renowned scientists called for, which is reversing the burden of proof within the precautionary principle. So activities proceed only if they are shown not to harm the ocean, singly or in combination with other activities. You might wonder why that might be relevant, and you heard a number of scientists get concerned because they immediately think that development cannot proceed. Well, that is how First Nations have always instructed me. That's what I've heard from them from the very beginning, is yes, development can proceed as long as we know it won't affect the fish. You know, I heard, and you'll recall the evidence on IPPs and the suggestion made by a couple of the witnesses, well, that First Nations might not only talk about, being interested in fish because they want to do IPPs sometimes and other. Of course they want to do development. They have communities that need to move forward in a modern context. But what's the principle they use when looking at all of that? It's the reverse principle that's here. They say, make sure you don't affect our fisheries, and then you can proceed. They don't say, go ahead and let's figure out later whether this can proceed or have an effect. If you can show that it doesn't, then we are very interested, because our commitment first is to the wild stocks and to what they have provided to our communities in the past and into the future. So I'm going to move on now, and I'm going to take you to the areas of the findings of fact regarding the current state of the Fraser River sockeye and the causes of decline. And I am going to now take you into our main submission, and in particular to paragraphs 73 onward on page 26. And you'll see from paragraph 73 through to 81, and then I have 3 additions. We took time to go through the evidence and summarize as best we could the key findings of fact that we think are relevant for the work that we have been doing and hearing around the current state of the stocks. Of course, both science and traditional ecological knowledge have ways of assessing the strengths and vulnerabilities of Fraser River sockeye salmon. You know, the amazing thing, of course, about the river is that it supports the largest abundance of Fraser River sockeye in the world, or at least sockeye salmon in the world, for a single river. It's incredibly long river, 1,600 kilometers. The watershed size is 223 square kilometers. The lake nursery area is huge. Over 50% of all salmon production in British Columbia occurs from the Fraser watershed. And that Fraser watershed has a very complex groupings of tributaries, streams, marshes, bogs. And the dependence of that salmon on this various habitat is real from First Nations perspectives. They don't say anything is irrelevant in that whole migratory route. It's all important. That's how we get this complex and incredibly old sockeye. It's no error. That complexity amongst the habitat, the complexity amongst the stocks is fundamental. And so is that long distance. Fraser River sockeye have widely varying life histories, genetics, and habitat characteristics that create different levels of vulnerability to the stresses that each stock encounters. The effects of those stressors on survival at any life part of the history stage depend on both the magnitude of the stress and the vulnerability of the salmon. And I'll stop there for a moment. So often we think, well, this little stressor over here or this little stressor over here isn't important. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But you have to look at the health of the habitat and the health of the salmon to determine whether or not cumulatively or otherwise the stresses are important. And the characteristics that have been found within the evidence that's before you is that varies between the stock and the specific part of the ecosystem that they rely on. At paragraph 77, I then begin to list the descriptions of the state of the stocks from the scientists. Interestingly, until 1977, about 80% of the sockeye salmon used the southern route, and now an increasing number, approximately 50%, entering the Strait of Georgia via the northern route. Although the cause of that change is not yet known, years of warmer sea surface temperature on the west coast of Vancouver Island may have resulted in more Fraser River sockeye salmon using the northern route. Despite an understanding of the migratory patterns of Fraser River sockeye salmon, the least well-known part of their life is their life at the sea. The oceanic distributions of populations of sockeye are not known with sufficient accuracy to understand if they varied from year to year or decade to decade or place to place. In 2009, only 1.5 million adult Fraser River sockeye returned to their spawning grounds, the lowest number since 1947, and only 14% of the preseason forecast of 10.5. This 2009 event was only the most recent in a series of indications that the population is facing serious, widespread problems. While the largest returns of these fish in 80 years occurred in the early 90s, this situation has now changed to having the lowest returns since the 1920s in 2007, 8, and 9. Declining productivity, you've heard much about that, has occurred over a much larger area than the Fraser watershed, and it's not unique to it. Most Fraser and many non-Fraser sockeye stocks show a decrease in population. 17 of the 19 stocks of Fraser River sockeye salmon have shown declines in productivity over the last 2 decades. 17 of the 19. It's a significant amount of those stocks, Commissioner Cohen, are in decline. 2 exceptions are Harrison and Lake Shuswap, and you often heard scientists compare, and we primarily stayed within Fraser River sockeye to do comparisons. But of course, when looking at a wild stock, we're not going to have all the details of any one particular stock, so they use comparisons. And here, the 2 particular comparisons that I think are relevant is the Harrison and the Lake Shuswap. The Harrison fish are known to have quite different juvenile life histories from other sockeye. They go to sea as fry instead of 1 year later as smolts, and then they appear to migrate through the Strait of Juan de Fuca rather than Johnson Strait. Those things are relevant when you consider the state of the stocks and the nature of the problems that are before us. Most stocks have had very poor spawner to returns per spawner in 2009, but the Columbia River did fine. Historical data on the survival of the stocks by life stage shows that the declines in total life cycle productivity from spawners to adult recruits has usually, and that's all we can say, has usually been associated with the declines in juvenile to adult survival, but not with the freshwater stage of spawner to juvenile productivity. We only have 9 Fraser River sockeye stocks where we have data on juvenile abundance. Only Gates sockeye has shown declines in juvenile productivity, but 7 of the 9 stocks showed consistent reductions in both juvenile productivity over these years with declining productivity from spawners to recruitments. There have been 3 separate phases of decline in productivity in Fraser River sockeye. It didn't just start in the 90s. Since 1950s. It first started in the 70s. Then there was another one, the second in the mid-1980s, and the most recent one is in the late 1990s, with individual stocks showing different trends. More importantly, for the state of the causes of decline from our perspective is that over the last 2 decades, there has been an increasing amount of en route loss and pre-spawn mortality or premature mortality on the spawning grounds of returning adult sockeye. ERL and PSM, as adult Fraser River sockeye, are significant factors that reduce the number of effective female spawners and thus pose a threat to the long-term viability of the populations. Generally, en route loss began to be reported back in 1992 for early Stewart, early summer, and the summer runs, but not until 1996 for the late runs. So it's not just in the late runs. No one should suggest that that's true. Relative to the total catch, and spawning ground escapement levels of ERL have been increasing. These fish are dying before they do what genetically they're programmed to do. Why? That's the question you have to ask. Not why is the marine changing? Why are these fish dying before they get to the spawning ground? And when they get to the spawning ground, why aren't they spawning? That's the nature of the problem. The early runs have the most years with high ERL, and the summer runs, the Quesnel and Chilco, have experienced few, if any, years with large ERL. There's good evidence that among the stock patterns, en route loss are indicative of stock-specific abilities to cope with warming waters and higher river temperatures. That's important also. It's not hitting all of the stocks all in the same way. That's something that's relevant when you consider the causes of decline and the steps we must take. Run timing appears to be relevant to en route loss. En route loss is stock specific within summer runs, with summer runs having the greatest thermal tolerance relative to earlier and later runs. Research to date emphasizes that stock-specific responses to both temperature and climate warming need to be considered in fisheries management and in conservation strategies. Pre-spawn mortality. When we get to contaminants, you'll see why we think it's incredibly important that you look at pre-spawn mortality. Is highly variable among the stocks, the run timing groups, and the years. Spawning abundance has declined in early Stewarts and several late run stocks during a time period when en route loss has become a significant component of the total fate of adult migrants in these groups of fish. Spawning abundance hasn't declined. Why? Because of the management adjustment. And that management adjustment is one of the strongest precautionary principles we're taking in the management right now. Many fish, Fraser River sockeye salmon, are strongly cyclical, where others aren't. While the literature offers some support that both simple and delayed density dependence occur for Fraser River sockeye, studies have so far failed to show conclusively that either form of density dependence has had substantial influences on Fraser River sockeye salmon dynamics. The results to date do not support the general hypothesis that efforts to rebuild Fraser population in recent years have resulted in overspawning. The only exception to that to this generalization is the Quesnel stock, which shows some evidence of delayed density dependence, and I'm going to turn to that topic in full. You'll hear, if I have time, that the traditional knowledge about this notion of over-escapement is not there. The belief that somehow we're putting too many spawners on the spawning ground is phenomenally confusing to the knowledge of traditional Aboriginal people. When you're looking at an ecosystem, you look at the whole of the ecosystem and how it's balanced. I want to direct you to paragraph 79 onward, 79, 80, and 81 of my submissions on the state of the stocks, keeping in mind that it's important not to just look at the stocks, but to look at the ecological systems. And so it's clear, and as I go on, that the ecological system is totally dynamic, and it has strongly changed as a result of human activity over the last 100 years. Because I want to add 3 additional facts to that list, I'm going to just find my place in my submissions. 348, page 119, there's an additional fact that I think is important in the state of the stocks, which is that salmon are highly susceptible to impacts from contaminants. This is not a species that can handle contaminants that well. Quite the opposite. They are inherently more sensitive to most contaminants than other aquatic organisms. It's another fact that I think is extremely important when you consider the state of the stocks. And secondly, the temperature is the master biological factor for fish. and can affect fish acutely and chronically. It controls everything from metabolism to physiology to behavior to feeding. And then finally, at paragraph 177 of our submissions, page 65, a fact that's relevant to the marine situation is that Dr. McKinnell made it clear that the maturing fish, and that's the fish that are in the ocean, must find food to put on 50% of their weight in the last spring at sea. So if that food in the large ocean aren't there, because there are, as Dr. Peterman suggested, a lot more pinks in the open ocean than there ever has been, then those salmon are not going to return from the ocean strong and fat. And that's exactly what they need to be. They need to be strong and fat to make it all the way home. It's important to recognize that many of the difficult threats to salmon are human population growth oriented, or water quality, or the quantity and quality of the habitat. You might say these are out of the direct responsibilities of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. It's interesting how the suggestions made in writing and oral submissions is that by one of the levels of government coming to the table, i.e. First Nations, and offering their help and their expertise, that is somehow an abdication of responsibility on the part of the federal crown. The federal crown and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans cannot solve this problem by themselves. There is no suggestion that they can. They can't solve it by themselves within their own government. They can't solve it without the provincial government at the table, accepting their responsibilities, and First Nations at the table, and I would submit all the members of the public and all of the stakeholders here. But those three governments must be at the table in order for there not to be an abdication of responsibilities. Now, much like a salmon, I've got to speed up a certain part of this run, and I'm going to work through as quickly as I can. I want this on the sheet, not because you have to study it while I'm doing it, but I think it's an incredibly important graphic overlay of what I'm about to do. And I always find having those things in front of me at least helps me understand the nature of the problem. And what I'm asking Mr. Lund to put forward to you is the figure 3.3-1 of the report, technical report number 6 that Mr. Marmor came and gave evidence on. And it just helps you get a sense of the problem, Mr. Commissioner. It's not an easy problem to solve as to all of the contributing factors to the causes of decline. It's clear that it's human related. There's no doubt about it, that it's the activities of humans that are challenging Fraser River sockeye salmon. Now, there's a couple of ways that I want to do this to get the nesting going on, and the first is the nature of the causes of decline in the freshwater and the challenges associated with that, and then I want to go to the causes of decline in the marine, and then we have to nest those geographical ways of separating it into the other types of challenges, all of which you've heard, but we took great pain in the written submissions to go in detail to provide you, in my view, and of course we're speaking our own perspective, but in a very balanced way of the evidence. So that, this is a public inquiry, this is not a trial, we're not here to mislead or suggest otherwise. It's been our approach to bring forward the evidence as best we can, and in a way that doesn't have to overly convince you of something far along the thing. It's pretty obvious in our view, the nature of the complexities associated with this. So in the freshwater, urbanization is an extremely challenging component of the impacts to Fraser River sockeye. In 2005, there were 4 million people in British Columbia, with 3.2 million people living in the urban areas concentrated around the lower Fraser River and the Strait of Georgia. Many of the development activities for housing, industry, infrastructure, transportation, forestry, agriculture, and mining have also taken place at or near the lower Fraser River and in urban and industrial centers, along the shorelines around the Strait of Georgia and have the potential to interact with habitats used by the Fraser River sockeye. We strongly rely on the testimony of Jason Wong and Rebecca Reed and Michael Crow and Patrice LeBlanc, showing that there is a slow net loss of habitat for Fraser River sockeye all along the Fraser River watershed, and that there is rapidly increasing amounts of impacts occurring from urbanization all along that migratory route in the fresh water. And the challenges with urbanization are extremely difficult when we get to contaminants and other matters. It may be that we can try to deal with things as we need to, but there are some things, that, particularly as it relates to contaminants, that are going to require very strong efforts. We heard from my friend from the province that logging we can check logging off the list. We don't have to worry about logging, and that's not the perspective that the First Nations Coalition has. There was very little time in this inquiry provided to look at this, and that's no fault. There were so many matters that had to be looked at. We can't conclude that logging is not having an effect. More research is clearly needed on forestry interactions, and DFO's research funds as relates to that have completely dried up. Witnesses weren't comfortable with this. The mountain pine beetle, the riparian standards, and fish stream crossings are not being properly looked at, and no rigorous monitoring or data collection is occurring. When we add to that the complexities of climate change, when this type of habitat and the unique components of this habitat are only going to become more important, then we say it's extremely important that the province come to the table and work hard with us to ensure that logging practices in the province are done precautionary. I want to turn to water use. Michael Crow testified that water management issues are one of the greatest challenges we face in the BC interior region in terms of ensuring conservation and protection of fish and fish habitat. You'll recall that the former Regional Director General Paul Sprout and the present Regional Director Sue Farlinger brought water management issues to you and said that they are one of the strong, challenging matters that requires collaboration with the province. Groundwater concerns were some of the strongest concerns for the salmon in the interior that Dr. McDonald spoke about. We wouldn't have sockeye salmon if it wasn't for groundwater, Dr. McDonald said. Dr. Orr talked about needing to ensure that pumping wells did not reduce the groundwater levels beyond what the sockeye could handle. In our view, the province is not adequately regulating or protecting water for sockeye nor groundwater, and this was confirmed by DFO's witness, Jason Wang. Jason Wang talked about and agreed that legislating environmental flow standards on fish-bearing streams in the New Water Act would be excellent to help protect fish. The First Nation Coalition submits that the decisions related to water management have the potential to affect the exercise of their Aboriginal rights. They submit that it would be useful to have a clear tripart consultative process involving First Nations, the province, and DFO to consider how the Water Act and the modernization can be done in a manner that protects Fraser River sockeye salmon. Just while I'm on water, there's an exhibit that I brought to your attention, which is Exhibit 1861, which is a good news story, one that my friend from the province spoke about in his submissions. And what was that? That was the bridge, Schedule 5 to the relations agreement of the Stotlames Agreement with BC Hydro, which was the Lower Bridge River Flow Adaptive Management Decision-Making Framework. You know, Commissioner Cohen, I've often wondered why it is that lawyers are here listening to all this evidence about fish and what, you know, we heard so much about what scientists can offer and all of the ways they do it, and we've heard about what First Nations, so what can lawyers offer? What can your perspective offer? Well, often we understand decision-making processes and structures and how they can be created in a manner that provides fairness and leads to justness. And that decision-making process that's there in that exhibit is an excellent example of what happened when Stotlium, DFO, and others began to work together to figure out how to make decisions about water and sockeye, and what values were going to be included, and how there was going to be a place for all those values. And it did take time. It was a bit precedent setting in the work of BC Hydro and the province in this matter. And the Stotlium were determined to make sure their values were included. And you'll remember Mr. Higgins saying, but it was through the exploration of our values and at the time we spent together that we did find a way that we could bring all of this information in. Ultimately, it led to a place where we had agreement on what the best way forward was. It was a very high value. So in general, in response to the reply that the province made in a number of paragraphs and in their submissions on how matters within the provincial jurisdiction are all fine, we say that all of the issues with respect to urbanization in the freshwater environment clearly show that the province must come to the table with active hands in the work of the sustainability of Fraser River sockeye, and that in our view, the way that we can help them structure the way they talk is to recommend, as we have in our suggested recommendations, Commissioner Cohen. We know you're working to provide recommendations to the federal ground, but your recommendations must include the strong suggestions and the strong recommendation that they seek to find clear tripart consultative processes that deal with matters of cross jurisdiction. Next is the causes of decline in the marine environment. The weight of the evidence supports the conclusion that the marine environment is the major cause for the poor 2009 Fraser River sockeye returns, and is significant for the overall declining trends in recent years. We say strongly, Commissioner Cohen, that we need to understand more specifically the migratory route, and as Mr. Marmark said, the bottlenecks along the migratory route of the Fraser River sockeye salmon. And that's not just the migratory route in the Strait of Georgia, although that's a good place to start, but we must, as the evidence shows, go all the way up to the Gulf of Alaska. In our submission, Dr. Peterman also says that the information his expertise brings is that we also need to look closely at what's happening in the Gulf of Alaska. And Dr. Welch's comments I put there for you. I think it's clear from the data that's available that they're not randomly distributed in the Gulf of Alaska. We don't fully understand it, but there are multiple sources of evidence that suggest different stocks have at least some degree different areas of distribution within the Gulf of Alaska. We think that is relevant given the concerns around international protection of pink and the competition for food. As it relates to the longer term declines and the decadal shifts that have occurred, we strongly recommend both technical report number 4 and technical report number 10. They were substantial work by experts in the field who had the opportunity to reveal the best evidence and information we can to look at what's happening in the marine. Technical report suggests it can be characterized as a 15-year decline in marine productivity, which bears a strong resemblance to the shift to lower productivity in 12 of the 16 stocks. The climatic marine changes and productivity changes were also picked up by Dr. Randall Peterman and Dr. Bridget Dorner, and who found that most Fraser and non-Fraser River sockeye stocks, both in the Canada and US, show a decline in productivity linked to what is occurring in the marine. Specifically with respect to 2009, I was very grateful that the weight of the focus and during the inquiry was not only on 2009, because as you know, sockeye salmon have varying trends and within the different stocks have varying trends. But what 2009 was so troubling about was that it was expected to be such a large year, and it came across with very, very small. And so we learned something that Aboriginal people have been concerned about for quite a long time, is that this declining trend has the ability, depending on what happens, to all of a sudden take out very large amounts of salmon from the marine. So it's not just a declining trend that we have to look at, and I think that's important for your work, Commissioner Cohen. It could be that some will say, just look at the productivity trends over times and make your decisions and only look at the marine. We can't do that, because the vulnerability of a stock could be affected in many different places within. And what we learned in 2009 is that the best scientific evidence after all of the work that happened here, and we wouldn't know that if this work hadn't happened. We wouldn't know that. The research wouldn't have been able to be done in that kind of comprehensive way. Is that there were unusual wind patterns in the Queen Charlotte Strait that contributed to low surface salinity. There was the most extreme sea surface temperature value since 1982 was in 2007, and the winter of 2006 into 2007 was the most extreme, with a thick layer of fresh water coming off the coastal mountains into the Queen Charlotte Strait. The consequences of all of that is that Dr. McKinnell, as one of the many esteemed people in Pisces who did the report number 4, concluded that the marine conditions they observed in the Queen Charlotte Strait region and the Queen Charlotte Sound regions, and even in the southwest Alaska, through the life history of the Fraser River smolts from 2000 and 2009, were consistent with the idea of poor survival in the marine. Marine conditions may have first occurred in the Strait of Georgia, and that's what Dr. Beamish tells us, and then that had a footprint of the larger scale effect that's going on. It was clear between Dr. Beamish and Dr. Welsh and Dr. McKinnell that it's not just the Strait of Georgia that we can look at. That's where Dr. Beamish's eyes are. The eyes must go broader, and they must include the work that's in Queen Charlotte Strait and the Sound to begin to understand what's going to occur and could occur in any one given year. Frankly, the marine is not one big empty box or blue box, or however the different metaphors that I've heard over the while. The marine is a very complex series of many, many different types of ecosystems. It's our understanding of the marine from a scientific perspective that needs to be developed. Are we going to wait for all of that research to occur? Frankly, I don't think that humans' relationship to Fraser River sockeye can wait until we understand all of the oceans. And frankly, shame on us if we did wait. I found it very fascinating that the coastal First Nations, the Haida that I represent here, and other coastal First Nations along the coast, over the last number of years, when working collaboratively on ecosystem-based management, what was one of the first and important steps they took forward? They started mapping that marine, and they started mapping the sensitive areas around that marine. Why? Because we don't need to wait for research to protect important places. We don't need to do more research in the marine to say important areas of the migratory route of Fraser River sockeye need to be protected and preserved in a precautionary manner. And it's that research that I commended to you on a number of occasions that the Haida have done and the coastal First Nations have done to ensure that we take steps now to protect the areas. In the international world, they're often called refugia. Here we can talk about sensitive areas, we can talk about refugia, we can do whatever we need to. But we need to figure out where that migratory route is, and we need to take steps now to protect it. Over time, as we go, as funding allows, of course, we need to understand the marine environment more. But we need to understand where the salmon are and where we need to protect them in the marine. What I'm going to speak on aquaculture, I'm not going to say much. There has been much spoken about it. It is an area of great concern to all those that care about wild salmon. What I can say as most succinctly as possible is that the location and the density and the situation that results in the fact that we have no strong, reliable evidence to understand the interactions between farm salmon and wild salmon. Who's bearing those risks? Those risks are being borne by the wild salmon and those who rely on that wild salmon, and in particular First Nations of this province. It is shocking. It was shocking for me, I hope, when you spent those 2 weeks and heard and saw the response that we had. It was shocking that people, first of all, sometimes don't think that First Nations care about this. It's one of their grave concerns. They've raised it with both the province and the federal government for many years. They have substantive concerns, and not one of the Crown governments can show you any deep substantive work that they have done with First Nations to properly inform them about the nature of the risks associated with disease transfer to wild fish, how that risk is being borne, what is that risk, and how can finfish aquaculture properly be managed as a way as to avoid those risks. There has been some debate about what the scientists say and which scientists you should believe and which scientists you shouldn't believe as it relates to aquaculture. As you saw, Commissioner Cohen, our approach in this inquiry with scientists was not to go after them about whether they should be relied upon or not. Science provides an information base from which we make decisions. The biases, the approaches, the perspectives, the history of a scientist is relevant to you when you're looking at that. But it's, I regretted on a number of occasions the few times when others in the room found it important to spend large amounts of time criticizing on whether or not a person had the credentials to speak what they are concerned about or the research they have. It would have been more useful in my submission if we had had the information. And I regretted that. And it continues to be a very strong concern for First Nations that we get the information. And so in our effort on aquaculture, we make it very clear, and in all of the recommendations, that First Nations must be involved in developing and doing an analysis, including the risk assessment analysis, on what are the ecologically and socially tolerable levels of disease that may transfer from farm fish to wild fish. We say the DFO must implement a research program, and we recommend that research program be funded by industry that monitors and understands the interactions between farm fish and wild fish, and in this case, the industry that I'm referring to is the aquaculture industry. This research has to be multi-years. It has to include specific work on the role of pathogens and the transfer from from farm to wild and wild to farm and all the way in between. And it has to consider the evolving interactions between environmental factors such as climate change, including increased water temperatures, pathogens, and disease. We're not in the situation we were in the 70s or the 80s or the early 90s as it relates to water temperature. Those are changing, and you heard much evidence about how contaminants and pathogens are becoming increasingly of concern because of the changes in the water temperature. So to somehow suggest that the perceptions and the ideas that were being used in the 1980s could inform good decisions now is not acceptable. It's not appropriate to turn a blind eye here, Commissioner. These are grave concerns, and the world has changed since those original siting decisions were made. They have changed fundamentally. There is a change in circumstances that requires different eyes, more precaution, and the location of those farms and the density of their farms in those unique places on the Fraser River sockeye salmon migratory route must be looked at very carefully. Just so the aquaculture industry doesn't feel I'm only concerned with contaminants from there, you have heard the issues as it results to around urbanization. There are many clear concerns that the wastewater streams of our urbanizations are causing grave concern. There are over 200 substances, chemicals of potential concern being released into the aquatic ecosystems within the Fraser River Basin. I refer you to technical report with respect to that. Many of them exceed the toxicity screening values. The results of the assessment of Technical 2 was indicated that exposure to contaminated surface water and sediment or accumulation of contaminants in fish tissues pose potential hazards to sockeye salmon utilizing spawning, rearing, and migration habitats within the Fraser River Basin. The chemicals of concern that occurred in water at concentrations sufficient to adversely affect the survival, growth, and reproduction of Fraser River sockeye salmon, and those chemicals of concern, those 200 don't even include the emerging chemicals of concern. And then to add insult to injury, Commissioner Cohen, salmon accumulate those chemicals as they feed, and they bring them back to their natal streams. Those chemicals don't go away, and so when there's a lot of salmon that get exposed to them, they take them all the way back to their natal streams, and they're passed on. The eastern shoreline of the Strait of Georgia shows very high concentrations of PCBs and PBDEs, and it's quite likely that's coming through our wastewater. I found it amazing to learn all of this and then to hear the province submit to you that there is nothing in their jurisdiction of concern to the decline in Fraser River sockeye salmon. Frankly, I'm not sure who they're trying to kid. They're not kidding the First Nations. Optimistically, I can refer you to work that's being done to collaborate in terms of finding out how the role of these contaminants can be best understood. We have things like the SISCA study and a number of other studies that we refer to in our report that show the work that can be done when governments collaborate to look at these important matters. Now, if you take contaminants and you take urbanization, you take the marine environment, and then you add to it climate change, and you recognize, as the report of Dr. Hinch and others did, that climate change brings a number of habitat protection measures of increased concern. We add to the concerns about predation. We add the concerns of a number of factors for climate change. I do have to ask you, what's wrong with the reversal of the application of the precautionary principle? When are we going to wait to do it? For how long will we wait to seriously ask ourselves, when can we apply a precautionary principle that makes sure that before humans do more along that migratory route, we prove it won't cause further harm? And when will we begin to take the steps to own the responsibilities we have, that it is our actions that are threatening Fraser River sockeye salmon, and it is our failure to act that's threatening Fraser River sockeye salmon? Dr. Hinch mentioned, and I think it's of importance, that with the growing concerns about how temperature will affect survival of the sockeye, that we'll need to consider stock or conservation unit specific management. He also mentioned very specific habitat protection measures that will need to be taken in order to help Fraser River sockeye salmon evolve through the changes in climate. If Fraser River sockeye are going to survive for our children and our grandchildren, then there will need to be more habitat measures, not less. I want to just stop there. There's been a lot of talk about no net loss and those components of habitat management. In addition to it not being monitored, not being successful, First Nations don't accept the notion that can be a no net loss of habitat by substituting one part of habitat for another part of habitat. All parts of habitat are important to Fraser River sockeye salmon. Finally, I'm not going to take much time on the cumulative impact section because at the beginning of this inquiry, Commissioner Cohen, we made submissions to you from the First Nations perspective that it was, of course, cumulative impacts that were the cause of the decline. So it became no surprise at the end of the day that that's what Mr. Marmor concluded. But what's of more importance, I think, of course, studying it and looking at the work that he's done and synthesized, it's very important, and I was grateful to the work Mr. Marmor did in synthesizing. But he did something wise from my history of working with Fraser River sockeye salmon and others. Instead of telling us what the priorities of research should be, or telling us why he thinks that, he gave us a process for determining that. And he suggested who should be at that process in order to determine those priorities. Because as ecosystems change, those priorities will change. And as funding and research changes, those priorities will change. but it's how we determine research priorities and expenditures of money that are keen and important to looking at cumulative impacts. It's how we ask the question. You know, a couple of times in my own humbleness, I sometimes got, oh man, I should have asked that scientist a question more precise. You saw how many of the scientists like the questions very, very precise. And a couple times, for some reason, the one with Dr. McKinnell and I became of concern, and I wish I could remember the specific question, but I can't right at the moment. But I remember him saying, I can't answer that because it's not precise enough a question. And I can tell you that that's a concern that many First Nations governments and others have brought to me on a number of occasions. They have said, who's deciding the question of these scientists? And now you have just oodles of evidence to show to you why that's of concern and why it's important to make sure that we ask the right questions. And so what Mr. Marmarick does is, after reviewing all these cumulative effects and being clear to you why we have a cumulative effect situation, his strongest recommendation was the proper process for moving forward. I think it's about 11:15, Commissioner Cohen. I'll just say this. I'm about halfway through, so hopefully I will finish on time, and I'm doing my best. And I just found it very interesting, not only in the written material and the oral presentation and all of the way through. When I asked the First Nation Coalition at the beginning of this brief, was it the environment or was it DFO's policies and practices and procedures that have caused the decline of Fraser River sockeye? And they sort of smile at me, as they often do when I ask questions like that, because it's sort of obvious to them they're sort of the same. And it was hard pressed for them to say it's only in the environment or it's only in the policies and practices of DFO. It's in all of it. The policies and practices of DFO and the policies and practices, not just of DFO, of the colonial governments, has got us to where we are. Decisions that are made about resource extraction and otherwise have got us to where we are now. And so for the rest of my submission, about halfway through, I'm going to spend time on the policies and practices of DFO and the recommendations going forward. Thank you.
The hearing will recess for 15 minutes.